The house felt bigger than ever, its silence stretching into every corner. It wasn't always like this. There used to be a rhythm to the days, a steady hum of conversation, the faint echo of laughter, the clinking of glasses over shared meals. But those sounds had faded long ago, leaving only the creak of the floorboards and the faint hum of the refrigerator to remind me I wasn't entirely alone. It had been 3 years since my husband passed, 3 long years of figuring out how to live without him, how to breathe in a space where every corner carried his memory. I thought I was getting better at it, learning how to fill the emptiness with routines and small distractions. But there were moments, like now, standing in the kitchen, staring blankly at a sink full of dishes, when the loneliness hit with a force that left me breathless. Nathan's arrival had been unexpected. He showed up at the door one rainy afternoon, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and an apologetic smile on his face. "I'm sorry to drop in like this," he'd said, his voice warm and familiar. "I just needed a place to figure things out." I didn't ask for details. The look in his eyes, a mix of exhaustion and quiet vulnerability, told me enough. He had always been a kind soul, the sort of young man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders without complaint. Seeing him like that, so raw and unguarded, had stirred something in me. "Of course," I'd said, stepping aside to let him in. "Stay as long as you need." That had been 3 weeks ago. Now, as I stood in the kitchen, reaching for a jar of spices on the top shelf of the pantry, I found myself thinking about him more than I should have. The house wasn't quite so empty with Nathan here. His presence filled the spaces I hadn't realized were so hollow. The sound of his footsteps as he moved about the guest room, the quiet hum of his voice when he was on the phone, even the way he left his coffee mug on the counter. It all brought life back to a place that had been stagnant for so long. But it also brought complications. Nathan wasn't the awkward teenager I remembered. He'd grown into a man, broad-shouldered, confident, with an easy smile that had a way of disarming even the most guarded people. And while I tried to remind myself of the years that separated us, of the roles we were supposed to play, there were moments when I caught myself lingering too long on the way his laugh lit up a room, or how his eyes softened when he spoke to me. I knew better. I had to know better. I was reaching for the jar when I felt him behind me. His presence was unmistakable, solid and warm, the faint scent of cedar and something clean wafting over me. I froze, my hand hovering just shy of the jar, my breath catching in my throat. "Let me help," Nathan said softly, his voice close enough to send a shiver down my spine. Before I could respond, his hand brushed lightly against my waist as he reached past me, his fingers closing around the jar with ease. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it left a trail of heat that lingered long after he stepped back. "Got it," he said, his tone casual as he set the jar on the counter. I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Thanks," I managed, my voice shaky. Nathan's eyes met mine, his expression open but unreadable. "You okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing slightly. "Fine," I said quickly, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. "Just tired." He nodded, though the look he gave me suggested he didn't quite believe me. "You should take a break," he said, his voice softer now. "You've been running yourself ragged." "I'm fine," I repeated, more firmly this time. Nathan hesitated, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer before he stepped back. "If you say so," he said lightly, though there was a note of concern in his voice. As he left the kitchen, I let out a shaky breath, my hands gripping the edge of the counter for support. It didn't mean anything, I told myself. It was just a moment, a small kindness, nothing more. But as I stood there, staring at the jar on the counter, I couldn't shake the memory of his hand brushing against my waist, the way my skin had seemed to come alive beneath his touch. And for the first time, I allowed myself to wonder if I was wrong. By the time the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet, the unease from earlier still clung to me. The brief moment in the pantry had replayed in my mind all afternoon, each detail sharper than it had any right to be. The heat of Nathan's presence, the way his hand had brushed against me, and, most unsettling of all, the way it had lingered in my thoughts long after he was gone. I told myself I was being ridiculous, reading too much into something that meant nothing. But when I heard his voice call out from the living room, warm and easy, I felt that same flutter in my chest, unbidden and undeniable. "Hey," Nathan said, stepping into the kitchen. He leaned against the doorway, his hands tucked into his pockets, his hair slightly mussed, as though he'd been lying down. "What do you think about letting me cook tonight?" "You?" I asked, arching a brow. He grinned, the boyish charm in his expression making it hard not to smile back. "Don't look so skeptical. I'm not half bad, you know." I hesitated, the tension of the day still weighing on me. But the hopeful look in his eyes, so earnest, so unguarded, made it impossible to say no. "All right," I said, crossing my arms. "Show me what you've got." Nathan moved around the kitchen with an ease that surprised me, pulling ingredients from the fridge and cabinets, as though he'd been living here for years. "I didn't realize you knew your way around a kitchen," I said, leaning against the counter as I watched him. "There's a lot you don't know about me," he replied, glancing at me over his shoulder. There was a teasing note in his voice, but something about the way his eyes lingered on mine made my stomach tighten. "Like what?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Nathan shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Like the fact that I make a mean chicken Alfredo," he said, holding up a jar of cream with a flourish. I couldn't help but laugh, the sound breaking through the heaviness that had been sitting in my chest all day. "I'll believe it when I taste it." The kitchen filled with the rich, comforting aroma of garlic and cream as Nathan worked, the clatter of pans and utensils creating a rhythm that felt strangely soothing. I found myself relaxing, the tension in my shoulders easing as I leaned against the counter, sipping a glass of wine. "Can you grab me the Parmesan?" Nathan asked, nodding toward the fridge. "Sure," I said, setting my glass down. When I handed him the cheese, our fingers brushed, and for a moment, I froze. It was such a small thing, so fleeting, but the warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me that I couldn't ignore. Nathan's gaze flicked to mine, his expression unreadable. "Thanks," he said softly, his voice quieter now. "Of course," I replied, my own voice trembling slightly. The moment passed quickly, but it left a mark. A quiet hum of something unspoken lingering in the air between us. By the time we sat down to eat, the sky outside had darkened, the faint chirp of crickets filling the stillness. Nathan had set the table, without me noticing, placing a candle in the center, as though this were something more than just a casual dinner. "This smells amazing," I said, eyeing the plate of creamy pasta in front of me. "Taste first, then compliment," Nathan teased, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. I took a bite, the flavors rich and decadent, and let out a soft hum of approval. "All right, you win. This is incredible." "See, told you I wasn't half bad," he said, his grin widening. We ate in companionable silence for a while, the soft flicker of the candlelight casting shadows across the room. But as the meal wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that Nathan was watching me, his gaze steady and intent. "What is it?" I asked finally, setting my fork down. Nathan hesitated, his expression thoughtful. "I'm just glad you let me stay," he said, his voice quieter now. "It's been a while since I felt like I had a place to land." His words hit harder than I expected, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "You'll always have a place here," I said softly. Nathan's eyes softened, and for a moment, the air between us felt charged, the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on us. "I mean it," I added, my voice trembling slightly. "I know," he said, his gaze unwavering. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, and I found myself struggling to breathe under the intensity of his stare. But before I could say anything more, Nathan leaned back in his chair, the moment breaking as he reached for his wine glass. "Thanks for trusting me with dinner," he said lightly, his tone teasing. "Anytime," I replied, forcing a small smile. But as we cleared the table and said goodnight, I couldn't ignore the quiet hum of something new that had settled between us, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The morning sunlight poured over the yard, golden and warm, promising a beautiful day. I stood on the porch, a cup of coffee cradled in my hands, staring out at the garden that had long since been overtaken by weeds. It was one of those projects I'd told myself I would get to someday, but the thought of tackling it alone always felt too overwhelming. "Looks like it needs some work," Nathan said, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. I turned to see him stepping out onto the porch, barefoot and holding his own mug of coffee. His hair was still tousled from sleep, and his t-shirt clung slightly to his chest from the humid air. "More than some," I replied, smiling faintly. "It's been years." "Well," he said, leaning against the railing, "today seems like a good day to do something about it." I raised an eyebrow. "You want to help me with the yard?" "Why not?" he asked, his grin easy and boyish. "It'll give us something to do. And I could use the fresh air." I hesitated, glancing back at the overgrown mess. "It's not going to be easy." "I'm tougher than I look," he teased, his eyes glinting. It wasn't the challenge I was worried about, but I didn't say that. Instead, I nodded and set my coffee cup down. "All right. Let's see what you've got." We started with the weeds, pulling out the invasive tangles that had crept into every corner of the garden. The work was tedious and dirty, but Nathan tackled it with enthusiasm, his laughter filling the air whenever he unearthed a particularly stubborn root. "You weren't kidding about this being a mess," he said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Don't say I didn't warn you," I replied, grinning. The sun climbed higher, and by mid-morning, we were both covered in dirt and sweat. But as the yard slowly began to take shape, I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. Nathan crouched beside me, pulling out the last of the weeds from a flower bed. "So what's next?" he asked, glancing up at me. "We plant," I said simply, nodding toward the small stack of flowers and shrubs I'd bought months ago but never found the energy to use. Nathan's grin widened. "Now we're getting to the fun part." As we dug holes and set the new plants in place, the air between us felt light, the conversation easy and unguarded. Nathan told me stories about his life in the city, the people he'd met, the job he'd left behind, and the reasons he'd felt so lost before coming here. "It sounds like you've been through a lot," I said softly, pressing a mound of soil around the base of a daisy. He shrugged, his expression turning thoughtful. "I guess, but coming here has helped." "You've helped?" I glanced at him, startled by the sincerity in his voice. "I haven't done anything." "You've done more than you realize," he said, his gaze steady. The intensity of his words left me breathless, and I quickly turned back to my work, unsure how to respond. By the time we finished, the yard looked completely transformed. The overgrown mess had been replaced with neat rows of flowers, the bright pops of color standing out against the rich, dark soil. "It looks amazing," Nathan said, stepping back to admire our work. "It does," I agreed, a sense of pride swelling in my chest. Nathan turned to me, a faint smile playing on his lips. "See? We make a pretty good team." I laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Don't get too comfortable. There's still the back garden to deal with." "I'm ready when you are," he said, his tone teasing but his eyes warm. We sat on the porch afterward, sipping lemonade and letting the cool breeze wash over us. My muscles ached from the work, but it was a good kind of ache, the kind that came from doing something worthwhile. Nathan leaned back in his chair, his long legs stretched out in front of him. "I needed this," he said, his voice quiet. "What, hard labor?" I asked, smiling. He chuckled, shaking his head. "No, this, being here, spending time with you." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and I felt my cheeks flush. "I'm glad you're here," I said softly, my fingers tightening around my glass. Nathan's gaze lingered on me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Me too," he said finally. The quiet stretched between us, filled with the hum of cicadas and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. But it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like the kind of silence you shared with someone who understood you, even without words. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the day we'd spent together. The easy laughter. The way his hand had lingered just a little too long when he'd passed me a trowel. The warmth in his voice when he said he was glad to be here. I told myself it was nothing. Just a natural closeness that came from working together. But deep down, I knew better. Something was shifting between us, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could pretend I didn't feel it. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and freshly planted flowers as I stepped onto the porch that evening. The yard looked beautiful in the fading light, but it was the kind of beauty that made your heart ache, that reminded you of everything you'd been missing for so long. I sat down on the swing, pulling a blanket over my lap and nursing the glass of wine I'd poured after dinner. The night was quiet, save for the faint chirp of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I let the stillness settle over me, hoping it would quiet the thoughts that had been racing through my mind all day. But when I heard the creak of the screen door behind me, my chest tightened, the familiar flutter of anticipation stirring within me. Nathan stepped onto the porch, a beer in his hand and his hair slightly damp from a shower. He hesitated for a moment before crossing the porch and sitting beside me on the swing. "You don't mind, do you?" he asked, his voice soft. "No," I said quickly, too quickly. "I don't mind." He smiled faintly, leaning back and stretching his long legs out in front of him. For a while we sat in silence, the swing swaying gently beneath us, the soft creak of the chains blending with the sounds of the night. "You've been quiet tonight," Nathan said eventually, breaking the silence. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around my glass. "Just thinking," I said. "About?" I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head. "Everything. Nothing. I don't know." Nathan turned to me, his gaze steady. "You can talk to me, about anything." His words, so simple yet so earnest, sent a pang through my chest. I looked down at my wine, swirling the liquid in the glass. "It's not that easy," I said softly. "Why not?" he asked, his tone gentle but insistent. "Because some things are better left unsaid," I replied, my voice trembling. Nathan didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he stared out at the yard. "I don't believe that," he said finally. I glanced at him, startled by the conviction in his voice. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I think the things we're most afraid to say are the ones we need to say the most," he said, his gaze still fixed on the garden. The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt my throat tighten. "What if saying them changes everything?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Nathan turned to me then, his eyes searching mine. "Maybe it's supposed to." The quiet between us grew heavier, thicker, until it felt almost unbearable. I set my glass down on the small table beside me, my hands trembling slightly. "I've been scared," I admitted finally, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Ever since your father died, I've been so scared of everything. Of being alone, of moving on, of feeling something again." Nathan's expression softened and he reached out, his hand resting lightly on mine. "You don't have to be scared," he said softly. "Not with me." His touch, his words, they unraveled something deep inside me, something I had spent years trying to keep locked away. "I don't know how to do this," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know how to let myself feel like this." "You don't have to figure it out all at once," Nathan said gently, his thumb brushing lightly against my knuckles. "We'll figure it out together." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw the quiet strength in his gaze, the unwavering steadiness that had always made me feel safe. Before I could think better of it, I leaned into him, my head resting against his shoulder. Nathan didn't hesitate, his arms sliding around me, pulling me closer. We sat like that for a long time, the swing swaying gently beneath us, the night wrapping around us like a cocoon. "Thank you," I whispered finally, my voice barely audible. "For what?" Nathan asked, his voice low. "For being here," I said, my throat tightening. "For not giving up on me." Nathan pressed a soft kiss to the top of my head, his lips lingering for a moment. "I'll never give up on you," he said quietly. His words broke something in me, and I felt the tears spill over, hot and unrelenting. I clung to him, my hands fisting in the fabric of his shirt as the sobs racked my chest. Nathan held me through it all, his arms steady, his voice soothing as he murmured soft reassurances. When the tears finally subsided, I pulled back slightly, my gaze meeting his. The moonlight illuminated his face, casting soft shadows across his features, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. "Nathan," I began, but the words faltered on my lips. "It's okay," he said softly, his hand lifting to brush a tear from my cheek. "You don't have to say anything." But I wanted to. I wanted to tell him everything, to lay bare the feelings I had been so afraid to admit to myself. Instead, I leaned forward, my forehead resting against his. The closeness was intoxicating, the warmth of him seeping into me, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to face everything alone. The storm rolled in just after midnight, the sound of rain tapping against the windows pulling me from a restless sleep. I lay there for a moment, listening to the low rumble of thunder in the distance, the flicker of lightning casting brief shadows across the room. Something about the storm felt ominous, charged, as though it carried the weight of everything I had been trying to ignore. I got out of bed, pulling on my robe, and made my way downstairs. The house felt too quiet, too still. The storm outside only amplifying the tension simmering inside me. I had just reached the kitchen when the power went out. The sudden darkness was disorienting, the familiar hum of the refrigerator replaced by an eerie silence. I fumbled for the drawer where I kept the flashlight, my hands trembling as I searched blindly. "Nora?" The sound of Nathan's voice made me jump, and I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light of the storm. "It's just the power," I said quickly, my voice shaky. "I figured," he replied, stepping closer. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. Nathan closed the distance between us, his presence steady and grounding. "You sure?" he asked, his tone softer now. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was trying to convince him, or myself of. He found the flashlight before I did, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. "Here," he said, handing it to me. His fingers brushed against mine, and even in the dim light, I could see the concern in his eyes. "Thanks," I murmured, taking the flashlight and flicking it toward the pantry. Nathan didn't move, his gaze lingering on me. "You seem on edge," he said after a moment. "It's just the storm," I replied, turning away to busy myself with finding candles. "It's more than that," he said gently. I froze, my back to him, my chest tightening at the quiet certainty in his voice. "Nathan, please," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Please what?" he asked, his tone soft but insistent. I turned to face him, the flashlight casting a faint glow between us. "Please don't make this harder than it already is," I said, my voice trembling. Nathan stepped closer, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "What if it's supposed to be hard?" he asked quietly. "What if that's the point?" The air between us felt impossibly thick, charged with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. Nathan took another step closer, his gaze steady, his voice low. "Talk to me, Nora," he said softly. "Tell me what you're thinking." "I'm thinking this is wrong," I said, my throat tightening. "Then why does it feel so right?" he countered, his voice quiet but firm. I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. "Because it's not supposed to be like this. You're... Don't," he interrupted, his voice gentle but commanding. "Don't put up walls we both know aren't real." The truth of his words cut through me, and I felt the first tear spill over, hot and unrelenting. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice breaking. Nathan closed the remaining distance between us, his hand lifting to cup my cheek. "So am I," he said softly. "But that doesn't mean we should ignore this." His touch was steady, grounding, and I found myself leaning into him despite every voice in my head screaming at me to stop. When he kissed me, it wasn't sudden or rushed. It was slow, deliberate, as though he was giving me every chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. The warmth of his lips against mine unraveled every thread of restraint I had been clinging to. My hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping him, as though he were the only thing keeping me from falling apart. Nathan's arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and the world outside seemed to disappear. The storm, the darkness, the weight of everything that had been holding me back. There was only him, only us, and the quiet, desperate need to feel something real. When we finally broke apart, our breaths mingling in the small space between us, I felt tears slipping down my cheeks. "Nora," Nathan said softly, his thumb brushing away a tear. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice trembling. "We'll figure it out," he said, his gaze steady. "Together." His words, his touch, the quiet conviction in his voice, it was enough to make me believe him. For the first time, I let myself lean into him completely, letting the storm rage outside while I found a fragile, fleeting sense of peace in his arms. The dawn broke quietly, the storm leaving behind a muted stillness that settled over the house. I stirred in bed, the faint warmth of sunlight brushing across my face, but it wasn't the light that woke me. It was the weight in my chest, a mix of emotions too tangled to name. I sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around me as I glanced toward the window. The world outside looked fresh and new, the rain having washed away the dust of the past few days. But the air inside the room felt heavy, thick with the unspoken truths and impossible questions that had filled the night. I heard footsteps in the hall, slow and deliberate, and my heart quickened despite myself. Nora? Nathan's voice was soft, tentative, as though he wasn't sure if he should be here. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hair slightly tousled, his expression cautious but warm. He held 2 mugs of coffee, the steam curling lazily into the air. "Morning," he said, his voice quiet. "Morning," I replied, my own voice barely above a whisper. Nathan crossed the room, setting one of the mugs on the nightstand beside me. He didn't sit, didn't move too close, as though he was giving me space to decide what came next. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable but charged, every unsaid word hanging in the air like a question. "I didn't mean to wake you," Nathan said finally, his tone careful. "It's okay," I said, wrapping my hands around the mug. The warmth seeped into my fingers, grounding me in a way I desperately needed. Nathan hesitated, his gaze flicking to mine. "How are you feeling?" The question was simple, but the weight behind it was anything but. I took a sip of coffee, the bitter taste steadying me as I searched for an answer. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "I feel everything, all at once." Nathan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Me too." The honesty in his voice, the quiet vulnerability in his eyes, it broke something in me, and I felt the tears welling up again. "I don't know what happens now," I said, my voice trembling. "We don't have to figure it all out today," Nathan said gently. He stepped closer then, crouching slightly so he was at eye level. "We'll take it one step at a time, together." His words, so simple yet so sure, settled over me like a balm. I nodded slowly, unable to trust my voice, and Nathan reached out, his hand covering mine where it rested on the mug. The warmth of his touch, the steadiness of it, it was enough to quiet the storm inside me, if only for a moment. Later that morning, we found ourselves in the garden again. The air was crisp, the ground still damp from the storm, and the flowers we'd planted days before seemed brighter, more vibrant. Nathan knelt by one of the flower beds, pulling a few stray weeds, while I stood a few feet away, watching him. "You don't have to do that," I said, crossing my arms. "I don't mind," he replied, glancing up at me with a small smile. I couldn't help but smile back, the weight in my chest easing just a little. "You're going to spoil me," I teased, though my voice was soft. "Maybe you deserve to be spoiled," he said lightly, though there was an undercurrent of sincerity in his tone that made my breath catch. I crouched beside him, my fingers brushing against the damp soil as I worked beside him. For a while, we didn't speak, the quiet between us filled with the sounds of the garden, the rustle of leaves, the distant chirp of birds, the steady rhythm of our movements. But the quiet wasn't heavy this time. It wasn't charged or uncomfortable. It was peaceful, easy, the kind of silence that felt like a shared understanding. When we finished, we sat together on the porch, our hands dirty, our faces smudged with soil. Nathan leaned back in his chair, his eyes closed as he tilted his face toward the sun. "You look happy," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Nathan opened his eyes, turning to look at me. "I am," he said simply. The honesty in his voice, the ease in his expression, it was enough to make my chest ache. "I don't know how you do it," I said softly, my gaze dropping to my hands. "Do what?" "Be so sure," I replied, my voice trembling. Nathan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he looked at me. "Because I know what I want," he said quietly, "and I know it's worth fighting for." The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt my throat tighten. "Nathan, you don't have to say anything," he said gently. "Not yet, just promise me you'll give this a chance, that you'll give us a chance." I looked at him, my chest tight with fear and hope and everything in between. And for the first time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't impossible. "I promise," I said softly, my voice steady despite the tears in my eyes. Nathan smiled then, the kind of smile that made the world feel lighter, and I felt something shift deep inside me, a quiet, fragile hope taking root. The path ahead wasn't clear. It wasn't simple or easy, and I knew there would be challenges we couldn't yet imagine. But as we sat there side by side, the sun warming our faces and the garden blooming around us, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt alive, and for now, that was enough.